is really important, but I'd refer you to reports published by the organization Womankind Worldwide. Every year I work on their report, doing research and writing of the taking stock Afghan women and girls 5 years on, 7 years on, and so on. Every year they publish a sort of balance sheet looking at how things have gotten worse or better, what action the international community is taking or not taking. They're honest and critical and make very pragmatic recommendations. So I'd refer you to those. But it's simply not fair to say that NATO is causing these problems, that they've made them worse. There's a very complex history that is related to politics, to culture, to religion, to outside interference, and to many other factors. And things have not gotten just worse. Security is certainly very rotten in the south, but the north is very stable. There's been huge economic growth, which is probably why there's five-star hotels and shopping malls being built in Afghanistan, because they're being built by the private sector, not by NATO or the Canadian government. The Taliban popularity going up, I don't think that that's founded at all. I'd like to hear your source, because that's not what I found when I have been on the ground. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you. Minutes for closing.
I think no matter which side of the debate we're on, we can all agree that we've witnessed over the last 3 years a resurgence of Taliban fighting and just generally of insurgency against the NATO occupation. And the source for the surveys on the popularity of the Taliban in South and East Afghanistan are the Senless Council reports. You asked what I would think about being responsible for or somehow complicit as a Canadian citizen in theocracy and war if we left. But what about the theocracy and the war that we've been supporting the last 6.5 years in Afghanistan? Saif, the guy who invited bin Laden to Afghanistan in the 80s, I know for most of you this name is exotic. His ally, Shinwari, was the chief of the Supreme Court of Afghanistan, appointed at the Loya Jirga, who insisted on calling it the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, and who has been part of systemically enforcing theocratic-like rulings, the type of ruling that have put people like Parviz Kambash in jail and facing the death penalty for downloading an article and circulating it at his university. We should demand as Canadians that Harper, forget the behind the scenes with this Khalid, let's be in front of the scenes, all of us demanding Parviz Kambash be released from jail right now. So history is not over. This is imperialism once again. History is repeating itself over and over. The British have already failed 3 times to subdue the Afghan people, to occupy them. Malalai Joya is not some kind of ideologue or eccentric, as some right-wing bloggers call her, when she says, if you continue to occupy and betray my people's democratic aspirations, we will resist, you will meet our resistance, and you will fail. This is proven by history. The Soviets learned this at the cost, arguably, of their existence, with some help from the United States funding and arming Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda during the 1980s, and in fact helping to lure the Soviets into Afghanistan. So the British 3 times, and prior to in Afghan history, many other empires trying to conquer this land, which is so unfortunately situated in Central Asia as a so-called buffer state, and has paid the price for that. Well, the British 3 times, the Russians famously for a decade. Now we're going to go a decade, till 2011, and see what the end result is. Folks, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Do we really expect a different result in Afghanistan? I predict, and many more sober-minded, centrist-minded scholars like Wynne Dyer, military experts, have said this war in Afghanistan is already lost. It's just a matter of time. That has been the result of Canadian policy, and it's been a result of the disservice to democracy in Canada that we have faced. The war on terror has been brought home as well. Omar Khadr sits in jail in Guantanamo Bay. We're the only country in the world that hasn't called for our child prisoners to be brought back to their home countries. Khadr should be brought back to Canada immediately to face trial here. That's what his supporters are asking for. And the Harper government should speak up in general about closing down Guantanamo Bay. They lied about torture for a year to the Canadian people, and we know it's still going on at Bagram Air Base. We know it's going on at secret prisons around the world, and we know for sure it's going on at Guantanamo. We need to end this whole war on terror. That's why we call for the troops to be brought home. That is the most important contribution people in Canada can make to fighting the Bush agenda, the Harper agenda of this war on terror, which is a war of terror. Let's bring the troops home. No more war and no more empire. Thank you.
The first point I'll make is that the Afghan government, whether or not we like it, is elected. So I won't argue further on that point. I think it's self-explanatory. Nothing that you've said justifies in any way the proposition that we should leave now. Nobody is arguing that there is a military-only solution to Afghanistan's problems. The question is when we should leave and under what conditions, and I'll just re-emphasize that point. We have a responsibility and accountability to the Afghan people to make sure that we don't cause further damage by a troop withdrawal that's untimely. Malalai Joya has done brave, important work in Afghanistan. She has her organization, and that's one Afghan women's organization out of an estimated 800 Afghan women's organizations. So there's lots of voices out there, and we need to listen to a diversity of women's voices in Afghanistan. In closing, I'll just say Canada simply cannot be impartial in a conflict with the Taliban. The Taliban are fascists, period. I've never met an Afghan in Afghanistan that agrees with their interpretation of Islam. They are perceived to be an imported consequence of Pakistani interference in Afghan affairs over the last 3 decades, and they have a large proportion of non-Afghans fighting with them: Chechens, Arabs, Uzbeks, North Africans. They also happen to not have any representation from 60 to 70% of the Afghan population, which is women. And for me, that's a good enough reason not to pay them any heed. I've had some first-hand experience in seeing what the Taliban have been doing to the Afghan population. Last summer, I was in Mazar when a suicide bomb exploded on a bus of police recruits in Kabul and killed 41 people. At that time, it was the worst explosion that had yet occurred in Afghanistan. And about a week later, the police caught 2 children who had suspicious vests on them, and they had bombs on their vests that they were going to detonate that Pakistani Taliban had put on them, and told them that if they walked up to a police officer in front of the Ministry of the Interior and pressed the button, that he'd give them some ice cream. The children had absolutely no idea what they had gotten involved in. Those were street children, orphans. To me, a genuine anti-war position is a position which calls for an international security presence in southern Afghanistan and for international intervention that aims to achieve human rights, development, and peace building in Afghanistan. The mission is not perfect. It is far from it. But progress has been made, and that simply cannot be washed over. I'm not here to defend the work of the military, the UN, the donor governments, or the Afghan government. I'm not here to defend any position of the Canadian government. There's not a political party in this country that I would dream of voting for, including the Conservatives, the NDPs, the Liberals. The point is that giving up and walking away and leaving Afghans to their own devices and at the mercy of the Taliban, and we've seen their track record with governance and development, is not what you do when you're not satisfied with how things are going. We'd probably be under a Nazi regime right now if that's how all people thought. In fact, the Senless Council, which you mentioned, their director in Afghanistan, Lauryn MacDonald, has said that withdrawing troops and giving Afghanistan back to the Taliban would be like giving Germany back to the Nazis. I am deeply disturbed whenever I've walked by a little gathering on the streets of Vancouver protesting Canada and Afghanistan, and I can't help but wonder, where are the protests for Chinese aggression in Tibet? Where are the protests for human rights in Uzbekistan or Syria, or human rights in Afghanistan for that matter? They are not there because Afghanistan, to groups like StopWar and to the NDP, is nothing more than an issue of politics vulnerable to being manipulated to death, literally to death. I